Tonight's program, The Weird of Genderqueer, is to help celebrate Pride Month. Anne Lovejoy may be best known as a gardener, designer, and writer, but she's also a board member of the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center, where she edits the newsletters and facilitates both the inclusion study group and the multi-generational queer elders family group, as well as the Sippin' Tea series, of conversations with Karen Vargas and Marva Jones, both longtime social justice workers with Kitsap Youth of Color. Anne is the founder of the Transfriending support group for family and friends of people in gender transition and exploration. She's the mother of a trans daughter and a cisgender son, and a delighted grandmother. Eve Palay is a tall, stylish trans woman of certain age, a writer, a mediator, and trainer at the Kitsap Dispute Resolution Center. She is on the board of the Washington Mediation Association and participates in several trans and pride groups, including Rainbow Crew Northwest, a local LGBTQ+ resource guide. And she leads the Transgender Day of Remembrance Faith Project, which connects with churches and temples. Eve has 2 adult daughters who are fine with her saying that any woman of a certain age, trans or not, gets to call herself stylish. She does trans trainings for organizations and businesses and believes we are all in transition. She will speak on what does my very public transition say about your perhaps quieter one. Let's talk. Okay, please welcome Anne and Eve.
Thank you, Lynn. We are delighted to be here. Eve and I do a great many, we speak together a lot in a lot of situations, and we would love to hear your questions. So I hope that you'll put them in the chat so that we can hear what you're interested in hearing about. I thought that I would begin basically by talking a little bit about my journey as a trans parent, because about 6 years ago, my daughter and son, as I thought, asked me to have lunch and said there was something important we needed to talk about. And given her historic history with deep depression, I actually thought that I was going to hear, "Mom, I really don't want to live anymore and I'm going to kill myself, but I don't want you to think it's your fault." So going in with that, when she said instead, "Mom, I'm trans," I was like, "Oh, okay." And then immediately stepped in it and said, "So does that mean you're a gay girl now?" She's like, "Oh, Mom, excuse me, but sex and gender have nothing to do with each other." And I was like, "They don't?" And she's like, "You never had to know that. You never had to know that." And that really stuck with me. And it's true. As a cisgender woman who assumed myself to be a straight woman all my life, or most of it, I never had to think about anything about the queer spectrum, though we've had many, many, many family friends who are on that queer spectrum. So it was a real eye-opener, and it was a really amazing sort of wake-up call to me, and it set me off on a journey of exploration. And with my daughter's permission, I began as a peer group, because one thing that I've found is that whenever things happen that are really difficult to manage, the most magical support you'll ever find is peer support. So I started the Transfriending support group for family and friends, as we heard, and we basically got together initially, maybe 15 or 20 people at the beginning, to just share experiences and talk about what was going on and share resources and share our ideas about what we might want to do or not want to do. And to some extent, it was also a place where, for a number of parents, there were things they wanted to grieve privately, not in front of their kid. Now, in my experience, I was just so glad to hear that she wasn't making an exit strategy statement, that I didn't care at all. I just had a lot to learn and discovered that my own ideas as I think many people's ideas about being transgender were pretty vague. Didn't really know what that was necessarily going to look like for her. So that was part of the exploration. But also listening to the many, many stories, I realized for so many kids these days, that journey starts a lot earlier. My daughter was 35. These kids that we're working with at the Transfriending group, some of them are 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 15, all the way up, but that there are kids of every age. And that has been really eye-opening for a lot of us, because I think many of us have an assumption that a child cannot know gender, cannot know that they're this, that, or the other. But it's quite obvious that they can. And there's some very solid science that shows that, in fact, children have a very clear idea about their own gender, if not much concern about anybody else's. It's the parents who maybe have much more concern about anybody else's. And that's one of the things we discovered too. So creating this safe space, coming together as peers, listening to each other's stories, sharing resources, sharing experiences, it's been so strengthening for us. We were lucky fairly early on too to get help and support from the Ingersoll Gender Center in Seattle, which is the longest continually running gender support center in the world. 1977, they haven't missed a week in all those years. And Marcia Botzer, who was the founder of the Ingersoll Center, met with us, came over to Bainbridge Island and met with us. And we had about 40 people sitting around in a living room talking about what we were trying to do. And she was invaluably supportive. And she said, if you need any support of any kind, let us be your umbrella. But whatever you do, don't have a board. Now, you board members might be laughing a little at this, but one of the things she said was, as soon as you have a board, you lose control of what's going on. And I thought that was a really interesting statement, because I'm on a number of boards myself. But I thought, yeah, maybe our Transfriending group simply needs to be person to person, peer to peer, not organized in a real, agency manner, but simply people meeting on that very personal level. And one of the things we discovered is that not only the parents needed to just meet on that personal level, but all of the trans people and the people in transition, the people gender questioning that we were working with also simply wanted to be met person to person on a personal level as a person, not as a trans person. That's a pretty interesting thought, that I think all of us have that same core desire to be seen as who we are in the world and not necessarily labeled as this, that, or the other. I'm not just a gardener, and I'm not just a writer, right? I'm a musician and a mom and a grandparent and a bunch of other things. So I think all of us want to be able to be free and comfortable to say who we are in the world. That, more than anything, I think, is what we've learned in our trans group so far. If any of you are interested or have friends who might benefit from that kind of support, I have put my email in the chat. And that's a trust thing that I'm doing, because I want people to be able to reach out. So if you need that yourself, or you know anybody else, please check the chat and you will see that information is there for you. Eve, what would you like to add?
Thank you, Anne. I wanted to unmute myself. That is kind of helpful. I've also put my name in email in the chat, and a reference to rainbowcrewnorthwest.org, and it's NW, not Northwest. And we, as said before, try to make sure that there's resources for the LGBTQ plus community on this side of the water. I guess I should explain a little bit about myself. I only came out about 6 years ago. And, I was married. I have 2 adult children, both daughters, and get along very well with them. I immediately went through 3 major transitions of coming out, getting divorced, and having a quad bypass. So honestly, the divorce is the biggest transition in my life rather than this, which is why I say that we're all in transition. We're all going through different transitions all the time. Anne gets bragging rights because she's got grandchildren and I don't. Let me check on my Fitbit. No, it says still no grandchildren. When I came out, one of the first things I wanted to do was try to make sure that it was easier for other people to come out, because I'd spent my life hiding from myself, not really being able to comprehend this impossibility, thinking, well, this is just cross-dressing or something like that. But no, that really didn't really interest me or consume me at all. It was something I knew from a very young age, but something that was impossible. I was one of 4 sons. I was son number 3. That was how my father introduced us. This is number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. So, dealing with this impossibility meant that I spent a lot of time ashamed of myself, feeling guilty about myself, trying to compensate in some way or another. I would, as a guy, I was the kind of person where if you're doing, a project at the school, you say, here, you take the sledgehammer and the rails and knock those things in. I'm not like that anymore. That's not the assumption people make anymore. It's really curious, all the differences that happen when you come out. I wanted to make sure that everybody had on this side of the water, because it's always been harder on this side of the water, away from the total queer community of Seattle, to find any kind of connection. And I specifically wanted to make sure that it was not just Kitsap County, but also Jefferson County and Clallam County. And I was trying to put together a organization that I called West Sound Transbrella, and was able to find, let the people at the Kitsap County trans community group know that there was a trans support group up at Port Townsend, which connected me to people from Clallam County. And I was so happy with myself going back to the bridge saying, oh yeah, this is a great idea. This is a great idea. And I was, on my way back, I'm sitting there saying, okay, now I got to connect with Pride, and I have to connect, with the local Pride, and I knew this. And then I said, the local with Pride. And I suddenly just, bopped myself on the head and said, you idiot, you are part of Pride now. That's who you are. It's not a question of joining or meeting with them. You belong there. And the other thing that came up to mind is, I was going to get in touch with the Navy, because they were just starting to, admit trans people at that time. And I was also said, going through who else I needed to connect with. And I said, oh yeah, the faith groups. And I said, wait a second, I'm not a faith person. What am I going to do? What am I going to say to the faith groups? And but I ended up being connected with them. And it was really important for me. It was a surprise. It was just absolutely a surprise that I now attend regularly the Bainbridge Island North Kitsap Interfaith Council meetings, and that they've been so kind as to accept me as one of them. And there's just these surprises that happen all the time that, I just say, God, that's so strange. How did that happen? I was having coffee with a friend, and I made some gesture while I was talking to her, and my hand just did this one of those arm waves a little bit further out, and I just stopped and they looked at my hand and say, how the foxtrot did you get over there? I didn't use the word the foxtrot. And my friend said, what? And I said, that gesture, I've never done that before. And I've never tried to, imitate a woman. I've just tried to be myself all along. And, it's just so weird. And she just says, well, that's just the first time you've noticed it. And I said, oh, okay. And there's all these changes that have come around. And one of them is that apparently I can talk to people without going off on some tangent all over the place. I do go off on tangents, I do these curlicues in my conversation, as you'll catch on to. But I didn't used to do that. I used to keep worrying all the time. Oh, I'm supposed to say this and this, and oh, what about this? Because I was thinking faster than I would speak. And now that doesn't happen. And I find that really weird. And I use the word weird in a really positive way. What is uncanny? How did I get these gestures that I'd never practiced, never had before, but they're there? How do I talk like this comfortably with all of you when that wasn't part of me before? How did I suddenly turn from a schlub to somebody who had some sense of fashion or style? I don't know, but it was weird. And looked into the word weird, which we have, everybody knows, two teenage girls, young teenage or pre-tween, the tweens or whatever, saying, that was really weird. And the other one saying, you mean weird or weird? As if there's a difference, but they know what the difference is. And one is weird and one is weird. What happened there? And looking into the word, back to the Old English or Old Danish, W-Y-R-D. And it talks about a person's truth, their destiny, their fate. That this will be something that is going to come at you all your life, and you need to accept it at some point. That this is your weird. This is where you belong. This is what is you. And your transitions can be any number of things. Divorce, the kids leaving, health problems, loss of someone. And how you react to that is your weird, your fate, how your truth. And so I'm kind of responsible for saying that this is the weird of genderqueer today. And I thought I should explain that some. And that's okay. We were talking about this at the Monday meeting of Transfriending, and when we had some trans kids there, and I'd said, we spend a whole lot of time normalizing things, saying being trans is normal. There's nothing really odd. This has gone on throughout history. We please accept it. And at the same time, I said, it's really weird if you're for a trans person to find out what they go through, your personal experience. And the kids were saying, oh yeah, it's weird. And I think that it's important when we talk to you or when you talk to other people, that you understand that, yeah, there is weirdness to hear, and don't condemn people for finding trans stuff strange. It's hard to navigate in a lot of ways. You're always afraid that you're going to make some mistake when dealing with a trans person, that the trans person will just jump right on you and cast you out of their life for saying the wrong thing. And I would say, well, we trans people have some, responsibility there too. Just we have, as anyone has responsibility in having a conversation with anyone else. And so I don't condemn people who don't know. I don't roll my eyes at them. I was at a party and somebody that's older guy, and it's always good for me to find people who are older than me, said, well, can I ask you some stuff about transgender? And I said, sure, go ahead, because that's what I do. And he said, what do you think about Caitlyn Jenner? And I said, okay, that's like the oddest first question. She'd been out for a year or so already, but that's what his reference point was. That's just what he knew. He wanted to know more. And I said, what I really liked about Caitlyn Jenner was that before her transition, she was a far-right, super Christian celebrity. And that after her transition, she was a far-right, super religious celebrity. That, you know, her being trans was just only one aspect of her. And I don't agree with everything that she says or anything. I don't get all bent out of shape about J.K. Rowling's, you know, or whatever she says. But that's just me. Some people got, you know, do get out of shape, and that's all right with me too. But I just want to know, I want people to know that, you know, honest curiosity is almost always okay. The trans people can tell, just like any other people can tell, if you're giving them a hard time or not. And that whatever questions you have, this is a safe place to ask them. That, you know, we're not going to roll our eyes and say, oh, why don't you know this already? And Anne is really good in this, you know, handling things this way as well. I think it's, you know, what she was talking about before is that we want to be seen as people. We want to see you as people. And that's, I guess, my opening.
If I could jump in a little bit, I guess I would say that you're right. When you first started talking about the weird in genderqueer, I thought, you know, what are you talking about? But you know, I have to admit that being a trans parent has its weird moments too, especially in the first, the early stages. Now, my daughter came out at 35 to me, and that meant that for 35 years, I had experienced this person as male. And it took a while. It really did. With all the will in the world, it took me a while to get past the history of this person, right? And yet I realized that if I mean, you know, so many parents have huge grief about, I've heard people talk about losing a daughter or losing a son or this or that. I didn't have any of that. My huge grief was, why didn't I know? How did I miss something so huge? And my daughter is extremely gracious and extremely kind and said, Mom, if I didn't really know, you couldn't really know. I don't know. But that piece for me was like the hardest part. But one of the things that happened for me and happened for a number of the parents in our group is that we all start looking at ourselves a little more closely too and saying, whoa, you know, and some of us have multiple children who are in the queer family, right? So we start saying, well, what about me? I've always assumed myself to be a cis straight woman, right? Well, what if, and when I was young, there were all these choices available to me? Well, that's kind of a weird thought for some of us, right? Like, what are we even going there? But I watch these younger people navigate with such grace and integrity and curiosity and strength and courage, looking for themselves at all these varying degrees of queerness. I guess we're just going to call it that because that's what the kids say. And it is easier. They said, you know, queer is an umbrella term that includes everybody. By the time you trot out the whole alphabet and everybody's like, oh, don't forget the I and the double A and the this, and it's like, no, those are letters. They're not people. We're only concerned here with people and their experience. And so I kind of reject the whole alphabet soup business, but I love the queer umbrella because, as Eve has said more than once, we're all a little bit queer. And I look in my own family history and think, oh, isn't that interesting? Very possible that somewhere on this wonderful, enormous spectrum, there is a slot that isn't exactly one end of the anchoring arc and the other end of the anchoring arc, right? There's a lot in the middle, which I find fascinating. And I think for many of us, examining our own lives, our own inclinations, isn't always comfortable. But one of the very first things you learn when you start looking at any kind of equity work, whether it's gender equity, social justice, whatever it is you better get ready to be more comfortable being uncomfortable. And dealing with the weird can be very uncomfortable at times. But that's how we stretch. That's how we get a little bigger. You know, if we want to grow and become bigger hearted, have more flexible minds and attitudes and thoughts, we need to be a little uncomfortable first. And that's part of the process, I guess. And that's where Eve would say, get ready to get weird, right?
Yeah, it is all weird. And but I think that all of us are weird in one way or another. I generally, to talk about, I've gone now talking about the queer and trans community, because it's because some people say, well, if you're trans, just what does that mean about whether you're gay or not? And I've gotten into some really weird discussions with people about at what point you are gay if you are trans. And the fact is that I do know people who one partner, who were in who were in gay relationships, both gay and lesbian, and stayed with their partner after their transition.
Mhm.
I've known people who are, were in what seemed to be a heterosexual arrangement, man and woman, who are now woman and woman and are still married.
Mhm.
And the woman who was originally just the wife, only identified as the one wife, says, I didn't suddenly become gay. I just, stayed with the person I love.
Yeah.
That's so it becomes ambiguous, and trans guys pass much more easily than trans women pass.
Yeah.
And so people can say, okay, that's you, and that's your wife, and that's cool, or that's your partner there. They'll, you're not gay. And you're saying, well, you actually don't know the state of their genitals. So it's
Well, and the state of their genitals may or may not have anything to do with it. That is not a defining aspect. A lot of people, when they get all ready to ask questions, one of the things they want to say is, has your daughter had the surgery? And I'm like, well, there are many, many surgeries a person might opt for, and over time they might change. There are quite a few. For instance, if you were born as a female, you might elect to have top surgery, which is what we call, breast removal. Or you might choose, on the other hand, to have breast augmentation, right? Those are some options. And you can have, your Adam's apple shaved, perhaps, if that's a choice you want to make. There are genital decisions to make, but those are not necessarily connected to your understanding of yourself as your gender, right? So,
Mhm.
and I think the kids are really clear about that, but the adults have much more trouble with it because we're so, we're black and white culture. We're like binary, yes, no, male, female, all or nothing. And there's such a great grayscale to explore. One piece for our family that's been very clear to me is that, and I've seen quite a bit of research on it, that quite a lot of genderqueer kids are also on a couple of other spectrums. OCD, common side overlap, also on the what used to be called the Asperger's spectrum. And that was a piece for me that when I started reading, there was no research on Asperger's in women, or very little, until pretty recently. And it was in Holland, they started seeing a lot of overlap between the genderqueer kids and the kids with mild Asperger's. And as they began describing how Asperger's presents in women and girls, I was like, oh my God, that is me to a T as a child. And yet when I was a child, okay, 70 years ago, 0 people in this planet knew to look for anything like that. They didn't know, what a genderqueer kid might look like, really. They didn't know what an Asperger's girl might look like, really. And even if they did, there would be no resources and no help. So one of the things I'm boggled by is all this great science that's coming out, teaching us how alike we all are and how different we all are. Like all these various spectrums. And Eve, you're fond of saying we're all in transition, but I would like to sort of say we're in transition on a number of fronts, right?
Oh yeah, we are, multiple fronts. We are all going through different things, and most of us are going through more than 1 or 2 different things at one time.
Yeah.
Before I was describing things as discrete, whether a divorce, health problems, losing someone, those can happen concurrently.
Mhm.
Having a child, you can be having a child and dealing with a parent who losing their rationality at the same time. You know, you can, you know, and these, you know, if you deal with more than 3 people, you are dealing with at least 6 spectrums. Yeah,
I
and
don't
that
know
doesn't
that.
even count your own.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to say, but I just think it's an interesting piece to look at, that genetically, we're all very complex. And it's so easy to try to simplify everything. And we're back to the AB, you know, yes, no, male, female. And really, that's just not how we're built. And we need to, you know, open it up a little bit.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
so we got
I just
here's
saw,
a question. Did you
I
see
just saw
the chat?
that, you know,
Yeah. go
no,
for
you,
it.
you know, in order to, the question is whether, you know, to be considered trans, you have to have, you know, gender confirming surgeries. And the answer is no, no, not at all. There used to be, even in, you know, at Ingersoll, when I, you know, dropped in, you know, started dropping in there in the 1990s, they have, like we said, the oldest continuing support group, and that's Wednesday night group. And that was exclusively for people who were getting ready for, you know, the surgical transition, you know, who were going full bore into, you know, all the surgeries. And, you know, I would go on Thursday nights where it was, you know, the more questioning and cross-dressing type of people. And the 2 were separate. So at one time it was considered, if you were transsexual, that meant you were getting the surgery. The word transgender wasn't really used then. You know, that came, you know, became popular a couple years later, and the groups melded together finally. And people realize, you know, that you can't do that. We also, you know, so yeah, it's just not necessary. You know, there are, you know, this transbrella that we exist under has all these different aspects to it. You know, now including, you know, people who are agender, gender non-conforming, gender variant, all sorts of descriptions. You know, gender questioning. You know, I would say they're all transgender, and they'll pick their own course for what fits them. I'm not going to tell you what surgeries I have or haven't had, because I don't think that that's a question I want to be asked of everyone. As what we were saying before, that's really not what you would ask anybody else.
Right? I mean, can you imagine going up to meet somebody and saying, "Oh, hi, how are you? Nice, you've moved into the neighborhood. By the way, what's in your pants?" You just wouldn't, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
wouldn't. And so that applies to anyone in the whole world. That's not your question to ask.
Yeah, you
Other
know,
than that, though, there's lots of questions you are welcome to ask usually, right?
yeah.
Well, and one of them is, I happen to know a person who is transgender. I don't even know what you call it.
Transition.
She was male and now she's female.
Mhm.
And I knew her when she was male. And every once in a while, I'll slip and say he,
Mhm.
and I have to slap myself and say, oops. But she's not bothered by that. And I guess my question to you, Eve, is that something that bothers you? Are you used to people being so used to referring to you as he that it doesn't faze you in the least?
It really is situational.
Hmm.
If it's a friend, you know, I have a mediator friend who just gets it wrong all the time. And, you know, he can't help himself. And because, you know, he knew me, we do trainings at the DRC, and we'll be talking to a group and, you know, what have you. And he'll just, you know, say something, refer to me as he, and I'll just stop and look at him. and look at the class and say, "Everybody else catch that?"
That's
I
a
will
good
publicly
way.
shame him,
Yeah,
but in a really gentle way, and that it's just a joke between us.
Mhm.
But there's also a way that, like, sometimes people who've known my daughter for many years will say, talk about the name what we call the egg name before you hatch. You have an egg
Right.
name and then you hatch and you have
Right.
your name that you choose, right? And I just gently correct them, or like if somebody says something that includes the wrong pronoun or name, then I'll just say, well, Lexi says today that she likes to do such and such. And but I don't have to say you're wrong. I just keep doing that.
Right.
It takes a while. It just
It
does.
does, yeah.
And for,
And,
the thing that's really interesting, let me just get this one out, is that for younger people, they're more plastic, right? And more malleable. And often they will pass much, much easier both ways because their bodies are still changing, even into their early 20s, much, much easier transition for many people, not everybody. But the older you get, the more fixed you are. And so for older people, it is much less easy to truly pass. And not everybody cares. Not everybody's not even into it. So that whole thing too of how you're going to present, whether you really are upset if somebody gets that you might be trans, that's a big spectrum right there too of how people respond to that. Wouldn't you say, Eve?
yes, well, I have two daughters, and when I came out, to their great surprise, one of them immediately started calling me she and her, and the other would not. But I knew there wasn't anything mean about it. There was just something that was dealing with the divorce and everything as well. So that's these loyalties and things. But she was my support person when I was getting my heart surgery. So she had to go to the intro to your heart, class with me, because I had a week or two before I had to go into surgery. And it was really funny because the nurse who was there was being very good about calling me she and her. And my daughter kept referring to me as he and him. And the poor nurse was going back and forth, and I'm just saying, that's my daughter, that's just what she does. I'm not going to get into this. And I didn't think that she loved me any less. I didn't need to correct her. I will correct people all over the place, but I'll do it in a way that I hope is, just saying, I really use she and her.
Yeah.
And
Well, I think what you said earlier about it being situational is broad enough, and that really kind of says it all.
yeah, I mean, your friend, the person knows where you're coming from.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
And they'll cut you some slack.
yeah.
If you keep doing it, they'll just roll their eyes.
Or she'll slap me up one side of the head.
Yeah, there we
And
go.
I would expect that.
The thing is that, after you apologize, just make it clear that, I'm going to do my best. I'm just,
Exactly.
and this is something that actually I think relates to what Anne was talking about, the plasticity and such, is that differentiating between genders, recognizing male and female, starts when you are an infant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called implicit memory. They identify who is male and who is female. And so there is a binary that's sort of built in. And if you got experience with the person, you got to get past what your initial thoughts were. It was curious to me, and that I think what's important here is that when they do research on implicit memory, I have not heard yet talking about just how young somebody is when they discover that there's something about their own gender that doesn't agree with everybody's perception of them.
Mm.
it's like, how do you know you're gay? You suddenly realize you're gay. You know, a lot of people deny that for a long time.
Mhm.
But, you know, but I think there's something that catches you when you're very young, where you realize that this differentiating male and female isn't working with yourself.
There is some research on that. There's a what do you call it? A research doctor in LA who's been doing quite a bit of work and works with a lot, and also sort of does counseling with a lot of parents of small children who
Mhm.
declare themselves to be the wrong gender, identified as the wrong gender, and says absolutely they're right. They know, it's not just, I'm playing a game and this week I'm a horse and next week I'm a frog and tomorrow I'm a girl. It's really much deeper than that, a deep knowing.
Yeah, there is this kind of deep knowing. And what's going on now is that there's enough public talk about transgender that kids can, feel free or to, understand themselves. For me, it was an impossibility. This could not be true. I had to hide this, and I hid it from not just everyone else. I hid it from myself.
Mhm.
And that's not the way you want to live.
No. Well, I guess the whole thing is grace,
Yeah.
you know?
If you can come at the world with any sense of grace, if you can, and grace means, one of the biggest things I think grace means is don't be defensive.
Right.
And I remember back in 2016, just after the election, that the YWCA put together a program for groups, organizations and groups who would feel threatened by the new president at that time. And my thought was, I attended that meeting, but my thought, and I hope I said it out loud, but I'm not actually sure. It's one of those things where I should have said this, and you say that enough to yourself that you believe that you actually did say it. That even if Hillary had won, these groups still needed to be together. That we cannot view ourselves as victims, because if my work from mediation tells me that if you present as a victim, whoever you're talking to will one up you on victimhood.
Mm.
That they will become the victim. And I think that's the problem with a lot of our politics right now, is that some people perceive trans people, gay people, Black people, women as portraying themselves as victims. So they'll tell you how they're the ones who are the real victims here. And I think that that's essential. The only way you can get around that is trying to treat people with some sense of grace.
Mhm. Well, unfortunately, we don't have any other questions that have shown up on the chat. But I will say to everyone who is listening, please, if you have any questions at all, our speakers are very happy to address them. So please give your questions to us.
And please do, because what always happens is afterward, people always get in touch and go, oh, I really wanted to ask this, but I was feeling embarrassed or shy or this or that. There are no stupid questions, and there are no bad questions, really. So yeah, I'll say that some of the, we can trade off talking about questions we get a lot, right?
Sure.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
Because I think
might
that's
open things up a little bit.
you're right.
There's a question on the
Yeah.
chat.
Right?
Well, there's a question in the chat.
Oh,
Right. What is it? Barb?
it says,
Oh,
Becoming Nicole is an excellent book that describes two twin boys, one of whom realized he was trans at an early age. Please recommend other titles that are helpful in understanding transgender issues.
Well, Anne's the one who reads, so I'll throw this to her.
Well, I will tell you that Kitsap Regional Library is pretty well equipped with books about transgender. And when my daughter first came out to me, I'm a library person. I've actually been a volunteer at the Bainbridge Public Library for about 30 years. Yeah. And was on the staff. I was on the board. I was the president of the board. I mean, I've been there. But the first thing I do when I'm in trouble is I go to the library and say, help me out here. And the reference librarians are awesome. And so when I first found out that my daughter was trans and I needed to learn more about that, I went to the library and decided I was going to read everything in the KRL collection that pertained to transgender. Well, that was, 6 years ago. And at that time, there was probably 30 books. Okay. And I read them all. And then a year later, I look and there's like 60. And a year later, there's like 200. And now there's so many. So what I would say is, depending on the age of your kid, you could go to the children's librarian at your local branch and ask for, maybe they'll say, well, George, here's this sweet book about a transgender kid, kind of figuring that path out for someone who's about, I think, 8 or 10, maybe. There's ones about children, very young kids. There's one for kids who have transgender grandparents or parents. There's all kinds of stuff. There's picture books. There's juvenile fiction. There's a ton of young adult, really awesome young adult books about being trans for every shade of experience you can think of. And many of them are really well written and beautiful and thoughtful and provocative. And all of them pretty much kind. And talk about grace. That is something that really sort of permeates these books. Interestingly, most of, and I'm just showing my bias here, but a lot of the ones written by adults for adults are not really that good. But the YA books are amazing. And I think part of it is because of the wave of public experience and public acceptance and the media acceptance and people showing up in films and magazines and everything else, queer became sort of semi-cool, right? And a lot of the kids talk about QT. It's like queer trans, like Eve was saying before. But this range of books, you'll find many of them have trans characters that are secondary characters, and being trans isn't, again, it's not the main thing about them. They're cool people and they're just in there because of that. But this range is just amazing to me, and we are rich in it. So go to the library and you will find anything you can think of. There's even books, some really good ones in the library system, about if you come from a very conservative religious family. And there's written by conservative religious parents who had this experience and have learned how to navigate it themselves, come to grace with their kid. And it's written, there's a couple of them. One of them is written by the parents with also the kids who is, I think 30 maybe or something. So all those voices get heard in this narrative of expansion and acceptance and grace as it grows in that family. So, and there's a great little series of pamphlets that are like the thing you give your grandmother. Your kid's gonna, Thanksgiving is coming, everybody's gonna eat at the table. You're like, oh, you know what? Sophie's actually Stanley now, we better have a chat. So you give this, there's those great little booklets, and any reference librarian can guide you to them. Isn't that awesome?
That's great.
And I do want to mention, the books that come to my mind are really now pretty old. The Jennifer Finney Boyle's book, She's Not There, her memoir.
Yeah.
And Kate Bornstein's Transgender Warrior, and which is where the word transgender really took off. Are both really good books, though they're old now. But I do want to mention Matrix movies. That the directors who were formerly brothers are now sisters. So Matrix Resurrection, when that came out last year, talks about that.
Huh. Are those action movies with Keanu Reeves? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
I never.
Wow.
There's trans character, a trans character in the TV series Sense8. It's a very strange series, but you see trans people now, actors. You have Laverne Cox in Orange Is the New Black, and this just goes on and on. It's almost harder to avoid any trans references these days in whatever you're watching.
So be aware that like in earlier, one of my friends who works at the library was putting me in touch with some older video stuff that was documentaries made in the 70s. And as he pointed out, some of them are kind of cringe making because the language is so different, and some of the attitudes are quite different, but some of it's really remarkably powerful and really beautiful still. So that archive is pretty rich. And the library also has that thing called, is it Calliope or something like that?
Well, this one doesn't have Canopy, but we have Curiosity Stream.
Yeah.
Which is the same.
Yeah, because you can stream a lot of this stuff off that is it Canopy, right? Yeah.
No, we don't have Canopy. We have Curiosity Stream.
Oh, okay.
But I know there, like, if you have sorry for interrupting, but if you have like a Kitsap Regional Library card and you're able to obtain a Seattle Public Library, then you can have access to Canopy.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what we did. Thank you. I forgot that's what it was. But yeah, those streaming services are awesome. And right, if you have a Kitsap Regional Public Library, we have reciprocity with Seattle, not King County, but Seattle Public Library. And they have a huge audiobook collection too, and with some great things to listen to. So yeah, open up that library door and get in there.
All right, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit here, if that's okay, Anne, because I do have to talk about a little bit of the darker side of things. And like I said before, I do the Transgender Day of Remembrance Faith Project, which connects with churches and temples, which Transgender Day of Remembrance is the day we read the names and circumstances of trans people who were murdered in the last year.
From all over the world.
From all over the world. The fact is that what I try to get the churches and temples to do is to just read 10 of the names, in November in their services or prayer groups or study groups. The thing is that trans people are at risk around the world. The thing is that just queer kids, not trans kids, have a higher rate of homelessness, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, and committing suicide. Trans kids have an exceptionally high rate of homelessness, substance abuse, suicide ideation, and attempts. And that we know of one from our group just this last month, that these are huge difficulties for the trans community. And the thing is that finding acceptance from just one person, but especially from your family, reduces those rates right back to normal. And that's, I don't want to give a Pollyanna view of what it is to be trans. You are at great risk. People don't know how they can work if they come out as trans. They think that, there are circumstances where we know of people whose careers have been stymied because they are trans. Because somebody decides, nope, I don't approve of this, and that's my view, and that's all that's to it. And so I want to acknowledge that there are many difficulties. While I approach people with goodwill, I'm always cognizant that that goodwill may not be returned. There was a Transgender Day of Visibility picnic that we had up in Clallam County. And I got into this discussion, let's not call it an argument, with one of the organizers of this, saying, if it's a day of visibility, we should be more visible than, a secret location at a state park. And they're saying, no, there's just too many people who are still, gonna come and give grief if they know that we're there. And I, of course, say, no, that doesn't happen. If they do, we can be ready. And their view was more of, we don't want to put these people in a position where they have to be ready. We want them to be able to relax. And then you had the thing with, just this last week with that group that was going to interrupt was going to riot at the Pride Parade in Coeur d'Alene. And so there is still a lot of active hate. And a lot of passive, I think that stuff is just too strange and we don't tolerate that around here. And around here can mean in this household. Mm-hmm. And, I know of too many trans kids who've been basically kicked out, literally kicked out. And that making sure that Kitsap County has resources for trans homeless kids, and trans homelessness can involve kids who are actually living on the street, but they're couch surfing here to there. This is what we really need, is a way to find a way that the groups that already exist can get together and say, how can we help make this happen? I don't have a huge solution. But I've talked to people at Fishline, they're interested. I've talked to our congressman, he's interested. The resources we have for homeless in this county are really bad. And the resources we have for homeless youth are even worse. And so if you're looking for a call to action, it's just that we need to find resources. We need to fund resources. We can't rely on the charity of different groups, because those groups often specifically exclude trans people and gay people. And that's been a huge problem. And as much as I respect, let's say, Coffee Oasis, and they still don't know exactly how to deal with trans people. And they've gone through different changes. I don't know where they are right now, but we need more transparency and more community involvement in what they're doing. So that it's not just them. So if this is a Kitsap group, and I always try to include Jefferson and Clallam counties, because I think these three counties and perhaps Mason are in our own world, that we need some cooperation to make sure that there are things that exist. We know where the risks are. We need to figure out exactly how we can best approach them. And we can't approach them but in the best way unless we really commit to saying, yeah, this kind of stuff is really needed. Mm. So that's my darker side view.
There's another question here that just popped up. My understanding is that physical gender and gender identity are two different processes. They often align, but sometimes not. Could you expand on this, please?
I think what they're trying to say is, not quite sure, like all of us at birth are assigned a gender, right? And sometimes that gender is a flip of the coin for a doctor, because some people are born with very ambiguous genitalia and are basically almost randomly assigned to be male or female. Intersex has been a very misunderstood state for a long, long time and often misdiagnosed or not recognized. There are now, what, 32, 34, I think, types of what used to just be ignored, right? And I think when we have a physical body that presents typically male or typically female, we make the assumption, and I think all of us as parents did, that our child was this, that, or the other. But it wasn't really recognizing that there is a lot of variability and that many, many people, like many athletes, are actually intersex, right? And have some qualities and characteristics of one gender and some from another gender. And so they're both. It's ambiguous, it's broad, but all of us can have some shade of that, right? Very few people are thumpingly 100% anything, right? And so the way that the gender is assigned at birth is the way that we're brought up culturally, until many, nowadays there's a little more flexibility and recognition that there is such a thing as gender diversity. And so there's more gender exploration and much more investigation and research and recognition of the whole spectrum of gender. And, within our group, for instance, I think I said earlier, the youngest kid that showed up was like 3.5 or something, very, very clear about her gender. But there have been a number of kids who were gender fluid, who chose to explore and stay exploring, and not necessarily choose a position, like say, I am completely this or that. And we've had some kids go through transition from one gender to another, decide that that wasn't actually the right fit, and semi-transition back and decide that they're simply trans. That is now a thing, which even 5 years ago, I don't think was very recognized. So there's just so much more fluidity than there has been before. So I think it's really difficult to sort of say your gender is specifically tied to I was going to say to your body, but of course you're in your body. But I guess the gender fluidity is something that's relatively new and not that widely recognized. But that is definitely saying my gender identity is not necessarily tied to the physical characteristics that my body displays. Does that make sense?
I would add that, I mean, the question being, that physical body and gender identity don't align is sort of like the definition of being transgender. My physical body that I had did not align with my perceived gender when I finally allowed myself to perceive my gender. So that, and it, so that is sort of like the definition of what being transgender is. And there are, what Anne was saying, all these other varieties that can fit in. And then I want to go back to what Anne first was talking about with her daughter saying sexuality and gender are two different things. So you've got people who know what their sexuality is, and they're fine with their birth gender, birth assigned gender, and you've got people who are okay with their sexuality but are not aligned with their birth identified gender. This is, like I said, this is where things start to get weird, and that we don't even know exactly where it is that we're trying to reach here in posing questions of identity. But identity is the basic philosophical question that is defied an easy answer for ages. It is you know, Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am.
Mhm.
You know, it is Spinoza saying, yeah, I agree with them, but honestly, it's just a gut instinct. You know, who you are, what your identity is an issue that we all are facing all the time. And trans people deal with this in a really public way. You know, you are making major changes that affect everybody around you and affect yourself. That you are defining yourself in a different way. And as far as what we were talking about before, when they deal with, you know, young kids who are coming up with this, the rule, at least 6 years ago, and I want you to know the rules seem to change all the time. You know, the words seem to change all the time. The rules need to change all the time. You know, and I wish there was just a memo that somebody would send me when you know, language changes. That I'm not supposed to say trans man, I'm supposed to say trans masculine, unless they say I can say trans man. So right now I'm saying trans guy, you know, because that's ambiguous, and I'm okay with ambiguity. But the three rules for gender identification, you know, or you know, for being trans were insistent, persistent, and consistent. If the person, the kid, the adult, you know, whatever, is consistent about what they're saying, they're insistent about what they're saying, and they keep persisting about this, then yeah, they're trans. You know, that's how they, you know, identify. You know, that was one. That's basically the test for kids. You know, but I would say, I thought that whatever I was dealing with, I could get past, I could just grow out of, I could just get over it. But, you know, persistently, consistently, and insistently, I couldn't. It was my weird to, you know, have to face this at some point. And that's what, you know, that's what happened.
I think one of the pieces that gets confusing for people is that transgender has no one single definition. And sometimes for parents, that can be an issue, because if you have a kid who's gender fluid, they might present more masculine sometimes and more feminine sometimes, wearing clothing, carrying on in activities and so forth. And for parents, that can just be like mind-blowing. You're like, well, what are you? When are you going to stop? And maybe they're not. Some people don't. And that can be really tough, because again, we like to categorize, and we like people to stay in their damn category, right? Like, once I got you figured out, you're supposed to stay there. But really, none of us are like that. And that's, I think, when Eve, you always say where everybody's always in transition. We're transitioning. I've been transitioning for 70 years to become the person I am today, right? And yet we really like that fixed definition. And I think limiting ourselves and our others and our dear ones and our friends and family that way is kind of a losing game, right? Because nobody is going to stay the same. They're really not.
No, I think that, like I was talking about, you know, grace is an incredibly important part of our growth as human beings. And what we're talking about here in all the different aspects is learning grace. You know, learning to be, you know, more curious than judgmental. Learning to be more open to, you know, really hearing. Being aware of other people's issues. And learning to respect everyone. Because that's really actually hard. And not to define ourselves by what we agree we don't like. You know, that was the most frustrating thing about the last president's years, where I was part of so many discussions where people would only talk about him and how awful he was, that we talked about nothing else. You know, that was the only thing that unified us. It was our only connection was a common enemy. And then, you know, right now, trans people specifically in different state legislatures, gay people in general in different legislatures, and women definitely in many, many state legislatures are the enemy. You know, the pro-abortion people are the enemy. You know, they're evil. The, you know, the gays, yeah, we're you know, Tucker Carlson just makes, you know, mockery of gay people and trans people all the time. The idea is to not define us ourselves by, you know, hating them, but by, you know, accepting each other.
Mhm.
You know, and one thing I found really fascinating early on when I was doing a lot of research is there was actually a study that's been followed up since. And unfortunately, as Eve said, many transgender people are murdered, mostly women. But autopsies showed that transgender people almost invariably have deep structures in their brains. They're pre-hormonal. They're formed before hormones fled the system. And sure enough, people who identify as female almost always have the deep structure of a female in their brains, even if they were physically born and identified as male at birth. But they know that's not right. I think that's fascinating. And similarly, some people who just know that they are male have the deep structures in their brains that are male. And again, pre-hormonal, so it's not influenced by the hormonal fluctuations. So it's like we're looking at the big early science on something that no one has looked at ever before, really. We're looking at something very new that's in flux. It's in transition, if you will. And we're looking at an emergent science of the nature of humanity.
Mm.
And that's fascinating, right? But why not let's be interested and curious, and instead of feeling threatened or wanting to make something right or wrong. I just find it very interesting and think if we can be intrigued with each other and fascinated by each other and maybe even enchanted with each other, it makes a much kinder world, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And, you know, you widen your world, you see surprising things. And, you know, I'll admit, I was taken aback by, you know, at one of our support group meetings, even though it was on Zoom, that this trans guy, beard, dark hair, was in his third trimester. And, you know, and now has delivered a child, apparently. You know, I said, cool, wonderful. I'm really curious to how this is going to work out. You know, but you know, that was a fact of that person. And for that person giving birth, presumably still, does not mean that he identifies as female.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, to me, that's, well, that is like the definition of female, isn't it? Giving birth, you know, but for him, not so much. And I don't know where I can go from there on this one.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's a great place to stop. Maybe we're at the end. You know, we haven't triggered a lot of questions, but here's what I would say, and I bet Eve would agree with me. If you all decide that you do have questions and you want to have another go at this, let us know and we'll arrange another time, because I'd like to think you really do have questions. And I'd like to think that after all the things we've said, there would be some wondering. And let's hear it. We'd love to. And again, my email is in the chat. I trust you with it. And if you do know anyone who is has someone in the family or is in themselves in gender questioning or curiosity or transition, and feels like some peer support would be helpful, please do share that, because we are stronger together. We help each other not just normalize, but we help each other succeed and become better people, I think. So thank you all for showing up.
And whatever Ann said, I agree.
Thank you both so much. It's been very fascinating, and I personally applaud you both for everything you have been through, everything you are going through, and kudos to you both. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks for having us and listening to us go on. Eve and I can go on for a really long time. So
No, 1 hour and a half is my limit, because then, you know, that's why I always have to leave, you know, early.
take his dog for a walk, basically.
Yeah, I have to take my dog for a walk.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And I want to thank specifically, I want to thank Barbara and Lynn for, you know, putting this together, and Jose for your good work here. Thank you so much.
Have a
Great.
good night, everybody. Bye.
Night. Thank
Night,
you.
night.